Shabbat Shalom. Hine matov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. See how good and how pleasant it is for brothers and sisters to sit together. We sang this verse from the Psalms last night as we began our services, as we do every week. As a teenager growing up in Tucson, I was an active member of our synagogue youth group. It was the Reform Temple, so the youth group was part of the National Reform Youth Organization, NIFTY, which stands for the National Federation of Temple Youth. Our region was SWIFTY, so you can kind of get a pattern here. The Southwest Federation of Temple Youth, and our particular group was TERY, which stood for Temple Emmanuel Reform Youth. I mention those names because we were all very aware that our youth group was part of a region. We had twice yearly regional retreats, and we were also aware that we were part of a national youth group with national conventions and a network of Reformed Jewish summer camps. Coming together as Jewish kids for summer camp or retreats was a significant part of my Jewish childhood. Singing songs together, Jewish songs or folk songs, praying together on Shabbat, all dressed in white at the camp in California. And Hine matovu manayim, that verse from Psalms, always played a significant part of our singing together. There's something about gathering together as a community that has a power of its own. You feel like you're part of something, that you're not an isolated person, self-absorbed, concerned only about your comfort and well-being. By connecting with others, we share a dream, a vision, a communal bond. We perform rituals that we learned as children, lighting candles on Shabbat, saying blessings over wine or grape juice, saying hamotzi, the blessing we say before we eat a meal. We light candles on Hanukkah. We build booths on Sukkot and wave the lulav and etrog, the palm branch and the citron. We eat matzah on Passover and avoid eating bread. We stay up late on Shavuot to study and share insights into our sacred texts and our spiritual teachings. We do these things in a community. It shapes our communal identity, not only with those in the room with us, but also knowing that Jews all over the country and all over the world are doing similar acts and praying similar words together. And also knowing that we are continuing traditions of our people that have been transmitted from generation to generation for thousands of years. It's very challenging to live a Jewish life where there's only a handful of Jews. In our Torah portion this morning, we read the calendar of Jewish holidays, the times we especially gather together as a community. And right before the calendar of holidays, which is in chapter 23 of Leviticus, at the end of chapter 22, there's a particular instruction that God gives to Moses and the Israelites. God says to Moses, "You shall faithfully observe my commandments. You shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified in the midst of the Israelite people. V'nekdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael." It is from this verse that our sages learned that God's holiness is best experienced in a community, in the midst of the Israelite people. From this verse and some rather circuitous interpretations of a few other verses, which we won't go into right now, the rabbis determined that certain prayers can only be recited when there are at least 10 Jewish adults gathering together to pray as a community. Now, if you're a member of just about any organization, you know that in order to conduct official business in that organization, you need to have a quorum. So too in Jewish worship, in order for certain prayers to be officially recited, we need a quorum of adult Jews. In fact, the origin of the bar and bat mitzvah celebration that we're celebrating this morning is based on this very idea. We need 10 adult Jews to create a quorum. And who counts as an adult? Well, someone who's 13 years old or older, at least for this purpose, counts as an adult. And once you have a quorum, which we call a minyan, Only an adult Jew can serve as the leader of that service. And so a Jewish child who reaches the age of 13, they therefore demonstrate to the congregation that they not only count in the quorum, the minyan, but that they can do so by leading a portion of the service. Of course, we can pray alone by ourselves. We can even choose to formulate our own prayers. Praying from the heart, tefillah shebalev, is highly praised in Jewish tradition. We can always open a prayer book and follow the traditional prayers written over the centuries by our own Jewish Shakespeares, who composed beautiful poetry as prayers to God. But some prayers we do not recite when we pray alone or only with a handful of other Jews. Baruch Hu, the call to worship, for instance, only makes sense when you have a prayer quorum. After all, who are you calling to pray together if you don't have a prayer quorum? So the Baruch Hu would be superfluous. But other prayers are also skipped when praying alone. Kaddish, whether it's the mourner's Kaddish, the Chatzi Kaddish, the Kaddish Shalem, and the Kedusha, the expanded prayer about God's holiness in the Amidah. They all sanctify God's name. That is to say that we proclaim God's exquisite essence. We encounter God's extraordinary dominion and energy only when we gather together as a community. And why a community? Perhaps one reason is that in Genesis, we're taught that each one of us contains a spark of God's holiness. Humanity was created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. But when 10 sparks of holiness gather together, it intensifies that image of God. It intensifies that holiness into a communal unity. Those sparks of holiness are magnified and unified to create a more tangible expression of God's presence among us. That may sound very holy and all that, but perhaps that was what I was feeling as a Jewish youth when we gathered as groups and sang songs together around the campfire. There was a special quality of sharing our voices in prayers and songs that expressed our yearning for peace, for love, for hope, in a world that so often seemed random and tense and sometimes even dark. We sanctify God's name, or we experience God's fullness of divinity when we pray together. V'nikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael, I will be sanctified, God said, in the midst of the children of Israel, the congregation. It's interesting that this verse appears right before the list of Jewish holidays. These holidays mark the special occasions when we Jews are supposed to gather together as a community, including weekly Shabbat services like this morning. One of the opening verses of that calendar is the verse that we use for Kiddush in the festival morning, the blessing we recite before we drink wine or grape juice. Eile moedei Adonai mikrai kodesh asher tikruotam b'moedam. These are the moedei kodesh, which you shall celebrate each at its appointed time. Now you may have noticed I didn't translate moedei kodesh, and that's because these two words can be translated in two very different ways. They can either refer to special occasions, that is, sacred times, or they can refer to sacred convocations, that is, sacred gatherings of people. And that very ambivalence, that ambiguity, links these two ideas. At sacred times, we come together to create sacred gatherings, a holy community. After the pandemic, when we had to be isolated for health and safety reasons, we can appreciate even more intensely the value and the power and the joy of coming together as a community with the shared purpose of praising God and acknowledging the preciousness of sharing our sparks of God's holiness with each other. At the same time, we know that Jews all over the country and all over the world are using the very same words, the very same prayers that we use to express our yearnings for peace and love, for God's presence in our lives, for hope and understanding among peoples around the world. These are the same words that our ancestors have used for thousands of years. Hine matov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. See how good and how pleasant it is for brothers and sisters to gather together. How wonderful it is that we are gathered here this morning, celebrating this Benot Mitzvah of Sophia and Olivia as they demonstrate they are now full members of our Jewish community. As we begin the prayers of our service this morning with the Musaf service, may we also together pray as the psalmist wrote in another psalm, Adonai sifatai tiftach ufi yagid tehilatecha. Open my lips, Adonai, that my mouth may declare your praises. Shabbat Shalom.